Hey everyone, what's up? My name is P3 and this is a Legacy Deck Tech. Today I want to talk about monoblack stuff. It is monoblack Pox, a 60 card constructed deck used in the Legacy format, and this is really just an opportunity to show off a novelty deck with some incredible cards and talk about some theory. Let's go. So, the first thing that you have to admit to yourself when you're playing a monoblack Pox deck is that you are not the aggressor. You are a control deck. You have no intention of winning the game quickly. You just want to sort of stall out the opponent and trade away resources until you end up ahead by gaining micro advantages and small tempo advantages. So the best card for this in mono black is Smallpox, or Pox in general. Uh, sort of like an archetype these days. Each player loses one life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, and sacrifices a land. We also have Big Pox. One copy of that. Oh, here it is. And my favorite thing about this spell is that it attacks the opponent's lands, as well as, um, you know, uh, controlling the board by getting rid of their creatures, which is something we definitely want. We don't have any creatures. Uh, we each discard a card, which isn't the best. It would be cool if only they discard a card, but that's probably too broken. And then same thing about sacrificing lands, but hey, it still works. We're gonna build our deck in such a way that it totally sort of bends the parity that Smallpox initially seems to create. Um, an important note about this deck is that it doesn't really do the same tactic that a traditional blue-white control deck would use, which would be to um, make land drops and kill all your creatures and get ahead of you in cards in their hand by creating a lot of 2-for-1s and using board wipes. And um, so obviously it stopped you from doing anything that you could do to kill the control deck. And then it has a whole bunch of mana at its access, and it can kill you with like efficient invisible threats like Celestial Colonnade and so on and so forth. This deck is more like a tempo deck where it has repetitive soft locks. That's what Smallpox really feels like, is a little soft lock. Sort of sets everything back a bit. Your opponent is trying to make the game go forwards, and you're dragging the game backwards. Um, so let's talk about Innocent Blood. There's 2 copies of Innocent Blood. We don't need more than 2, because there's plenty of other creature removal. It's just about right. Each player sacrifices a creature. Now, we also have these sinkholes over here. Target player, well no, you destroy 1 land. You don't target player, you destroy any target land. So if you cast Dark Ritual on turn 1, you can cast an Innocent Blood and a sinkhole. So imagine this. Your opponent plays a land and a creature and passes. And then you play a land, Dark Ritual, Innocent Blood, make them sacrifice their creature, and then you cast Sinkhole, make them, well, destroy their land. And then at the end of your turn, when you say go, pass back to them, uh, they have nothing, and you have a land, which is really cool. That's some kind of advantage. But you have many less cards in your hand at that point. They've only played 2 cards, and you've had to use 3. So this is weird. Well, imagine the last card in your hand is Smallpox. And they only had 1 card in their hand. And they had a creature out. All of a sudden, Smallpox becomes a 2-for-1 in your advantage. And that extra card that they had in their hand doesn't matter. That's pretty sneaky. But you still have your extra land, don't you? You still have your extra land from the beginning. After all of that is said and done, it's pretty sneaky. Because that's exactly what this deck is trying to do, is get itself into a position where the opponent has no lands, no creatures, no cards in hand, nothing. They have nothing. And you just have a little bit of something, just a little bit of something to work with. Maybe an extra couple lands, maybe a Liliana Planeswalker. Maybe you have a Curse Scroll. That's one of the classic win conditions in this deck. It creates a lot of damage over time. I mean, since we're not the aggro deck, we have no intention of beating the opponent quickly. So then when do we plan on beating the opponent? In the first, if not as fast as possible, say in the first 2, 3, 4 turns, then when? The 5th turn? The 6th turn? Would it be the 10th turn? Maybe the 20th turn? Well, we have 50 some odd turns to work with. This deck doesn't draw any cards. Maybe the opponent has a plan to draw some cards. Then we can literally just sit there and watch them mill themselves out. Oh yeah. Especially if Liliana gets to them, if she starts to ult and stick around after that even. Really, really bad. So sneaky. Very sneaky strategy. So what else is in this deck? We have an Ensnaring Bridge, a single copy of that. We have a lot of 1-ofs in this deck, which makes a lot of sense with the Tutors. Let's just talk about the Tutors really quick. So I'm running 2 Infernal Tutors. I'm not sure if anyone else does this. I was inspired by a deck list I saw online by, forgive me if I mispronounce this, it is a Japanese name, Adachi Ryosuke. He is the original inspiration for having a 27 land deck. And that makes a lot of sense when you're running 5 cards which trade lands, because you're probably going to be able to make every land drop for the first many turns, and your opponent probably won't. So if you're able to trade away all of your opponent's lands, you still have some extra lands out. And if you have lands, then you can play Magic. If you don't have lands, if you don't have mana, you can't play Magic. If resources stuck in your hand, they get eaten up by cards like Liliana, Smallpox, Box. So Infernal Tutor is awesome because it works really well with the nature of this deck. Unlike a traditional blue-white control deck, it's going to try and have as many cards in its hand. It could never cast this, but we get to cast this. We just get to cast Demonic Tutor and summon up any card we want. It's silly broken. Usually we're going to go for our Ensnaring Bridge, to lock up the game if the opponent is already attacking us. It's usually just really safe. Um, if you already have Ensnaring Bridge out, you're really hoping to draw Curse Scroll or one of your Infernal Tutors so that you could get to a win condition. Let's see. You could look for Chains of Mephistopheles, which is just a one of in this deck, and it essentially hard counters the blue decks, especially any Brainstorm player. I mean, there's a lot of random card draw here and there. Storm, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of blue decks in Legacy, a lot of Brainstorm players. There's so many that you wonder why it's not just banned. But I mean, who cares? It's Legacy. Let the players have their Brainstorm. But yeah, here is a Chains of Mephistopheles to stop all of those broken blue player shenanigans. Don't even think about it. This card is rather infamous for people not even knowing what the heck it does. There was a point in time in Magic's history where you would have this card played against you, you would ask what it does, they would explain it to you, and you still wouldn't understand it. And because you didn't want to feel dumb, you would just keep playing the game and then eventually run into its effect and just lose. How frustrating. So I'm just going to tell you what it does. If ever a player would draw a card, except for the first card they draw during their draw step, you know how every turn you get to draw a card in Magic? That's one of the rules. Well, if you ever draw a card except that card you get naturally, if you ever draw a card, then Chains of Mephistopheles will mess with you. It will cause you to, instead of just drawing the card, you discard a card from your hand and then you draw a card. You have to do a little whoop whoop. Discard first and then draw. And if you have no cards in your hand and you try to draw a card, then you just mill cards. You don't get to draw anything. So Chains of Mephistopheles is a replacement effect for any time you would draw a card outside of your normal draw step. It has two different replacement effects, one for if you have cards in your hand, one for if you don't. And either way, it stops you from gaining card advantage, which is not something we want you to have. You get to have no card advantage, none of that. All right, let's move on. We've spent too much time on that. Hymn of Torak. I bet all the monoblack players love that, by the way. Just me ranting about Chains of Mephistopheles, but everyone else is like, groan. Hymn to Torak. We have two in this deck. It's sort of like Innocent Blood. It's just right. You don't need more because there's plenty of other discard, including 4 copies of Thoughtseize. It's sort of non sequitur. It's sort of obvious. It doesn't really have any relationship with the rest of the deck. It's just really, really good. And you can cast it on turn 1, and it's black. So there it is. Invading your opponent's hand and identifying what their strategy is so powerful, because then you can sequence perfectly. If your opponent doesn't have the same information, they will be sequencing blindly or only guessing. That's why discard is so powerful. Here's the last win condition in the main deck. It's Bitter Blossoms, or I should say, there's Mishra's Factories, last non-land win condition. Borb. The amazing thing about Bitter Blossom is that the creatures have flying and are 1/1s, which means they work perfectly if you have an Ensnaring Bridge out. Now, it makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't have 2 Curse Scrolls and instead replace an extra Curse Scroll with Bitter Blossom. I mean, don't get me wrong, Curse Scroll is a great card, but you don't ever want two out. But you could definitely have a Curse Scroll and a Bitter Blossom out. That would be awesome. And Bitter Blossom, it may not be quite as efficient in terms of controlling the opponent, but it still has utility outside of just dealing damage to the opponent while ensnaring bridge is out and being difficult to remove. And even if you kill the creatures, it makes more. So it sort of eats away at your card advantage if you try to deal with the creatures. Nothing really works against it. That's why it's so good. Especially if it gets out early, even if you remove it, then the damage has already been done. There's too many tokens out. The tokens can block, so they set up a defensive wall for your Liliana Planeswalker. It's just, it's so nuts. It's so nuts in this deck, especially with Dark Ritual and the other 1-mana spells. Yeah, if you get the Dark Ritual double Bitter Blossom or Dark Ritual chains Bitter Blossom on turn 2, or yeah, there's a lot of really good usage for Dark Ritual on turn 2. And yeah, the last card in the last non-land card in the main deck is the Singleton Nether Void. Ooh. It mana leaks all spells. What else is there to say about it? It's especially potent as a hard lock. It's like the one card in this deck that just hard locks the opponent. Outside of maybe the Ensnaring Bridge, but I mean, this thing's just brutal. Like in a land destruction deck, are you kidding me? It won't be able to cast anything if this comes out. This is essentially the hard counter to a lot of combo decks. If you Dark Ritual this out on turn 2, the game is done. I've mulliganed to find that in many scenarios and been successful. And so there it is. All right, let's clean up a bit and talk about the lands, because this deck has a really amazing mana base. 27 lands is a lot, and it certainly makes sense if we're trading lands. We don't want to get stuck in the exact same scenario as our opponent. Like, why would we want the same number of lands as our opponent if we're trading lands? That certainly doesn't make sense. Because then aren't we just getting stuck in the exact same position as our opponent? Why wouldn't we want more lands? Here's 11 swamps. A quick note about swamps. These are snow covered because I'm too lazy to find and or sleeve regular swamps, but at this point I think I would, because snow covered lands in general are becoming too ubiquitous, too common, that a smart player is going to start taking advantage of that. And I just can't imagine there's anything out there that takes advantage of basic lands. But there are cards that take advantage of snow-covered lands. There are. This is a monoblack video. We're not going to mention anything. Here is a Tabernacle of Pendrel Vale. Ooh. I will say it is not used as a resource as often as how notorious it is. Like, there it is. You don't use it as much. But when you do need it, it does come out and just kind of devastate the opponent. It gets, especially if your opponent is playing elves, there's a really hilarious troll that you can do with Tabernacle where, I mean, they can keep playing creatures even if you destroy all their lands, because all of their creatures tap for mana, but then they end up not being able to do anything with any of their creatures except for pay for the Tabernacle upkeep cost. And so they just end up with a board full of creatures they can't use and die very slowly. It's so funny. All right, here's a Mazavith. It's a single one of. It's really good at shutting down Merit Lages, any kind of prime time, attackers in general. This is the bane of the combat step, and it is especially good in this deck alongside the Tabernacle because we have 4 Urborgs, which will not only paint these into swamps, but give them the ability to tap the mana. Like, so we have the 4 Mishra's Factories and the 4 Wastelands. Do I really need to talk about these? I mean, let's just talk about Urborg, because these lands only create colorless mana. These lands create no mana at all. And Urborg fixes all of that. It's so wonderful. You absolutely need to have 4. Don't worry about drawing extras of anything, basically, because with Smallpox and Liliana, you can discard extra copies, and that's a really good way to trade out, you know, a card you may not need with a card that your opponent probably does need. Last 2 cards in the main deck. Cabal Pit. If you're running the Crucible of Worlds, this card becomes especially good, which is generally a metagame choice. It comes out of the sideboard. I try not to run Crucible in the main deck. You just don't have time. Trust me, it sounds fun with the Wastelands and all that, but you just don't have time. Even against control decks, it's like, when do you squeeze that in? Because it doesn't do anything on its own. Every other card, like, really, I don't know. You need stuff around the Crucible to make it really effective. Let's take a quick trip through the sideboard. So I just have a pile of options. I'm sure there are even better options out there. I haven't actually played this deck since maybe a year or 2 ago. It's been hard getting out there. Not a lot of legacy players, none in my friend groups, so I only ever played against people at the local game store and at GPs. Yeah, I put up a lot of 3-0s and 4-0s with this deck. So try and don't touch the main deck. The sideboard is certainly a metagame thing. You want to customize that to be the best possible sideboard for your metagame. But the main deck is basically perfect. Don't mess with any of that. Tombstalkers. This is a trick that I like to use. I usually have 2, sometimes just 1. There's a lot of situations where you're going to take the Ensnaring Bridge out of your deck. Or maybe you imagine that your opponent has a certain ratio of spells in their deck which kills creatures. They came prepared to kill creatures, and in the first game they see a monoblack deck with 0 creatures in the main deck, just some man lands, and they found their Swords to Plowshares and what's not just sitting in their hand being useless. That's not a feeling any player wants, so they're going to try and board out those spells, which is a wonderful opportunity, don't you think, to just play a Tombstalker and beat them in the face? It has flying, they can't even block it, it's so fast. And because of how infrequent answers will become after game 1, like, they're going to start to look at trying to blow up artifacts and enchantments and planeswalkers and get ahead with onboard, on-hand resources. They're not going to be looking to run removal. So having creatures in your sideboard, Gurmag Angler is a good one. The Delve creatures are especially useful because they take advantage of the fact that you're able to fill up your graveyard so quickly. Smallpox puts a ton of cards into your graveyard. So let's count. Smallpox, a land, a card from your hand. That's 3. 2 mana, 3 cards in your graveyard. It's pretty good. You also got Dark Rituals, lots of 1-mana spells, blah, blah, blah. Delve is good. I especially like flying. Just don't even give your opponent a chance to block. A Singleton Duress is a must-have in your sideboard. In every I feel like in almost every sideboard where duress is a legal card, a single duress should be there. You can make a whole video about that. I'm not going to talk about it right now. Here is a Singleton Phyrexian Obliterator. This creature just kind of makes me feel good, but it's also a second Ensnaring Bridge. It actually has a lot of practical application in games where Ensnaring Bridge is really powerful against creatures that attack on the ground. In those instances, bringing in the Phyrexian Obliterator is essentially like having a second Ensnaring Bridge, but it's better because you can attack with it, and they won't block. Lost Legacy. I'm sure there are versions of this card which are better, like maybe Necromentia. I'm not sure. There's cards out there. The idea is to bring this in game 3, unless you're absolutely certain what your opponent is going to bring in game 2. Very risky to try it on game 2. Instead, wait for your third game, if they get one, to identify what their sideboard tech is, and then use Lost Legacy to remove that. Like, if they only have a few options in their sideboard which can deal with an Ensnaring Bridge, if Ensnaring Bridge then is also hard locking out their entire deck, then you bring in Lost Legacy, get rid of their way to get rid of Ensnaring Bridge, and then they cannot beat Ensnaring Bridge. Ensnaring Bridge equals GG. It's an easy way to win the game. I often pilot a sideboard where I have 2 additional copies of Bitter Blossom. I think it's really good bringing these in alongside the Tombstalkers because I like to bring in the Bitter Blossoms, the Tombstalkers, and the Obliterator all at the same time. Just kind of, you just all of a sudden have a ton of creatures. It's really weird how many creatures you can get out. Like if you Dark Writ out a Bitter Blossom, have some Mishra's Factories out, and then cast a creature, then all of a sudden you can attack with like 5 or 6 creatures and close out games in 2 combat steps. It's wicked cool. Your opponent may think, oh, he's this ponderously slow prison deck that's trying to wait for his tutor to get Ensnaring Bridge, and that's the only way he can win. No, 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 no. That ain't true at all. We go hard. We go hard. 4 Leylines of the Void. This is also in the sideboard. This is the answer. This is how you defeat graveyard decks. Any deck that wants to use its graveyard quickly, just mulligan to get a Leyline. That is the answer. If you think to yourself, what about Nilhill Spellbomb? What about Ravenous Trap? What about Relic of Progenitus? Blah, 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 blah. You cast a Leyline of the Void, and they lose. Or you just put it. It says, oh no, yeah, you begin the game with it on the battlefield. They don't even have a chance. You turn winning matchups into a simple average of do you draw the Leyline or do you not. Okay, here's the Crucible of Worlds. We talked about that already. You may want to have a couple extra Hymn to Thorax in your sideboard. Is this more than 15 cards? Probably. It doesn't matter. These are just like all options. This is good against control decks. If you notice you have a really hard time emptying out your opponent's hand, more Hymns is good because it's just a simple 2-for-1. It's really powerful. Your opponent doesn't get to control what cards they lose. And it's cheap in the mana. All nice things. And here's some anti-creature deck stuffs. Engineered Plague and Knight of Souls Betrayal. I used to run 2 Knight of Souls Betrayals, but now if I think that I'm running up against creature decks, I do something like 2 Engineered Plagues and a Knight of Souls Betrayal, or just 2 Engineered Plagues, or maybe just 1 Engineered Plague. Why not Knight of Souls Betrayal? um, because it hits your Bitter Blossoms. I like my Bitter Blossoms against creature decks. That makes sense. Bitter Blossoms are there to block as well as attack. Uh, we get utility by making them into blockers as well as they're always attackers. So um, we don't want to cast a Knight of Souls Betrayal and wipe out our own Bitter Blossom tokens. That doesn't make any sense. And we want to use our Bitter Blossoms against the opponent's creatures. We would also like to use the Knight of Souls Betrayal against the opponent's creatures. So it seems like there's a conflict of interest here. Instead of doing that, Engineered Plague. You name the creature type that gets the debuff. And I think a lot of times you're going to run into tribal decks, goblins, elves, merfolk. Tribal is really strong in Legacy, and I think players would rather just, like, if they are going to spam the board with creatures, if a mass debuff on creatures is necessary, then they are probably tribal anyways. There it is. And I think the opportunity cost is just better for Engineered Plague. That's the whole deck.